Hey guys, welcome back! I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is a pro-revenge story. Some minor details might be a bit off since I have no desire to reopen old wounds. I came out on top, and digging it back up can only tarnish the sweet taste of victory. Let's start by mentioning that I spent around 15 years in the security field. During that time, I worked various security gigs in different locations. The relevant one for this story was my stint at the rental housing tribunal in a major city, essentially acting as a bailiff of sorts. For those unfamiliar, picture a courtroom, in a big city anyway. In smaller towns, it might be a hotel conference room or community center, like you see on TV, but less formal, with an adjudicator instead of a judge. They're functionally the same as judges for landlords and tenants, but definitely not the same thing. This place solely deals with landlord-tenant disputes and is the only avenue to resolve such conflicts. I wasn't technically a bailiff, and it wasn't a court, but those terms give you a decent idea of the situation and my role in it. For around 3 years, I worked at the rental housing tribunal in my early to mid-20s. Being a major metropolitan area, the sheer volume of cases I witnessed was beyond counting. I saw it all. No landlord-tenant horror story can faze me because I've seen every possible scenario play out in excruciating detail. One of my duties was ensuring all parties had copies of any evidence presented. I did a ton of photocopying and always reviewed everything I copied to prevent anything from being cut off or rendered illegible. By the time I left, I probably knew the ins and outs well enough to be an adjudicator myself. Well, obviously not, but I certainly don't need a lawyer if I ever have to go there again. I also had an intimate understanding of how the system worked beyond just the rules. For instance, adjudicators would always give a little more leeway to self-represented parties over those with lawyers, or how pissed off they'd get when someone spoke out of turn. Seriously, don't do that. Fast forward several years. I'd left the city and was living in a decent-sized town in the same province, same tenant laws. I had a few roommates in a spacious townhouse. We got along well, but there was a problem. Only I could write checks, and our pay schedules didn't align. So I was the one paying rent, and I usually couldn't do it on the first because my roommates didn't always pay me on time. We told the landlord we might be a day or two late, but would always have it by the third at the latest. They were totally fine with it since I discussed it with them directly. This system worked smoothly for over a year. No complaints from the landlord because even if we were often a day or two behind, we always paid up. We were also relatively quiet and didn't damage the property. Nearly model tenants. I have no clue why, but one day that changed. I suspect a different person at the company started overseeing our region. Suddenly, we got summoned to the rental housing tribunal, hereafter RHT, on the 2nd of the month for non-payment of rent. This didn't actually lead to a case since we paid the same day, but now we had to cover the application fee the landlord paid to serve the summons. I complained to our neighbor, who was also the superintendent, and eventually heard back that their contact at the company was now demanding payment on the 1st with no exceptions. Well, that really didn't work for us, so we probably had to cough up that fee 15, 20 times over the next couple of years. I could have taken them to the tribunal over it, but we were technically in the wrong, and I knew it. Maybe if I went enough times, I could nail them for harassment, but I didn't have the time or energy, and my roommates didn't care. After splitting it between us all, the fee wasn't a big enough deterrent to change our behavior, so we just accepted it. If that was the only issue, there wouldn't be much of a story, though. Around the same time, the rent leniency disappeared, so did mandatory maintenance. I'm not going to list everything that went wrong and didn't get fixed. You'll get a decent idea by the end. We suffered through it. We were all working too many hours at crappy pay to actually do anything about it. We adapted, but after around 2 years, it all fell apart. Everyone but me moved out for various reasons within a 4-month period. I'm not going into any details about my former roommates because things kind of exploded for a few different reasons beyond this situation. No need to dredge any of that up. I had been saving up for a while and was able to quit my job without immediately needing another, so I suddenly had a lot of free time. I didn't want to stay and pay the full rent myself or find new roommates I could tolerate. And with my experience at the RHT, I knew I had the landlord by the balls. So I went for them. I stopped paying rent. Annoyingly, I didn't get a summons the first month, but I did the second. So I went to the hearing, armed with a meticulously documented mountain of evidence detailing the landlord's failure to maintain the property and entering without proper notice. I had a copy for the landlord and the adjudicator. I knew from experience that technically you're supposed to provide the other party with evidence before the tribunal, but I also knew about that leeway adjudicators give to self-represented parties. So I didn't give the landlord the evidence until our case was called, a 100% total ambush. What is the meaning of this? The landlord's lawyer sputtered, furious at the surprise evidence dump. The adjudicator just waved him off. Simmer down, Mr. Evans. While unorthodox, Mr. Harris is within his rights as a self-represented tenant. I'll allow it. They argued they were ambushed, but the adjudicator just dismissed the case, gave me a mild dressing down, and told me to file my own summons as I should have done. This was the petty revenge. The landlord and lawyer had driven 3 hours to get there for nothing, worse than nothing. I filed my own summons and the big day arrived. At this point, it had been about 4 months since I'd paid rent. I was prepared to pay if I lost, but I didn't think I would. The whole thing couldn't have gone better. I had 30 pages of evidence and over 20 photographs. They had nothing. No actual defense for our water heater being out for 6 months or us not having a fridge for a year, just to mention 2 severe issues. Their entire defense rested on us being late with rent, which actually worked against them once the adjudicator learned how many times we'd paid that application fee. Any lies they told had no supporting evidence. They even talked over me a few times, and I saw in the adjudicator's eyes that one time I opened my mouth to protest during their turn, but forced myself to shut up with every ounce of willpower, only letting out a squeak. He respected me for that. He had zero respect for the landlord. I had won on every possible front. The only question was, how much? It was more than I'd ever seen awarded. I got 9 months of free rent, and the landlord was ordered to have everything fixed before the next month was over, or I'd get more. I gave notice I was leaving at the end of the 8th month and left at the end of the 9th. Because the landlord had never renewed the lease, I didn't have to give the 3-month notice the lease specified. If you want a figure, I basically got a judgment worth around $18,000 in my favor after adjusting for inflation and rounding up. I also made the landlord and lawyer drive 3 hours twice, only to lose spectacularly. The landlord's face was so red at the end I thought he might stroke out right there. He didn't though. Bye, Jeff. The next one is an entitled people story. I've lived in my house for over 20 years now. It's a nice little place with a big backyard that backs onto a wooded area. The trees provide privacy and shade, and I've always loved listening to the birds that nest in them. About 2 years ago, the house next door sold and a new neighbor moved in. I went over to introduce myself and welcome him to the neighborhood. His name was John, and he seemed friendly enough at first. Little did I know the nightmare that was to come. The first sign of trouble was when John started doing major renovations on his house. I'm talking ripping off siding, redoing the roof, the whole shebang. The banging and power tools went on from dawn till dusk. I tried to be understanding, after all it was his house. But then came the fateful day when the chopping started. One morning I woke up to the sound of chainsaws absolutely decimating the trees behind John's house. I ran outside to find his crew cutting down every single tree, leaving nothing but stumps. My backyard was now completely exposed. I hurried over and asked John what on earth he was doing. He casually replied, "Oh, just clearing some land to extend my yard." I pointed out that those weren't his trees to cut down. John shrugged and said the property line was fuzzy and it was probably on his land. I knew for a fact those trees were not on his property. There was a clearly defined tree line that had been there way before John moved in. But reasoning with him was useless. By the end of the week, every last tree behind his house was gone. At first, I was just angry. But as the days went on, I realized the true impact of losing that natural border. Noise from the street filtered in, headlights at night shone directly into my bedroom. I had zero privacy anymore. But the greatest loss was my beloved oak tree. This tree had been growing in my backyard for decades before I moved in. I used to play in that tree as a kid, have picnics under it as an adult. It provided perfect shade on hot summer days. Losing it would be like losing a piece of myself, and now its days were numbered. With no protection, it was completely exposed. Leaves were drying out, branches dying. Every day I watched helplessly as it withered away. I tried approaching John one more time, begging him to at least leave my oak tree alone. Again, he dismissed me, saying he was allowed to improve his property however he wanted. I even offered to pay to have some new trees planted as a buffer, but John refused. It was perfectly clear I would get no cooperation from my stubborn, tree-hating neighbor. So I got myself a lawyer and took John to court for illegally destroying my tree. In court, John continued to insist the trees had been on his property, but I provided photos and surveys clearly delineating the property line, which he had crossed. I also shared just how much that oak tree meant to me and the damage John had caused by leaving it exposed. The judge listened patiently, examined the evidence, and then ruled completely in my favor. Not only did he order John to pay for removal of the now dead oak, but also to replace it with a mature tree of comparable size. Additionally, he was ordered to plant new trees along the property line he had improperly cleared, trees that would take years to grow to their previous majesty. But at least it was a start to regaining some privacy. John was furious at the verdict. As we left the courtroom, he got right in my face and shouted that he would chop down every single new tree that was planted. I calmly told him that if he so much as touched one, I would drag him right back to court. Sure enough, a crew soon arrived to dig up and remove my dead oak. It was a bittersweet moment saying goodbye, but I knew its legacy would live on in the new tree to be planted. A few weeks later, I stood watching happily as a small crane lowered a full-sized oak into place where the old one once stood. It wasn't quite the same, but in time it would grow back to its former glory. That first night, I sat on my back porch looking up through the oak's branches at the stars above. Despite John's best efforts, he had not succeeded in taking away this little piece of my past. Justice had prevailed, and though John would remain an awful neighbor, his damage was slowly being undone. The sounds of the woods were not there yet, but in my mind I could imagine the birds and rustling leaves that would one day return. For now, it was enough to have my solid, steadfast oak standing watch over my yard once more. The next one is a petty revenge story. I, 23F, recently graduated this past weekend, and my parents came to my city to have dinner with me. When we were talking at dinner, my mom reminded me of a kid I used to attend high school with. I honestly didn't remember this story until she said his name, but I think it was a pretty satisfying moment in my young life. For context, I've been playing violin as a casual hobby for the vast part of my life. My grandma knew someone through the grapevine who would mentor me, and I attended her lessons from kindergarten all the way to senior year of high school. I have a pretty good grasp of the instrument and an echoic memory, which is a neat little party trick. I did do some recitals here and there, but the closest I'd ever come to playing in a group was with my old church, and even then it was pretty laid back. When I was a freshman, I joined with my school's string orchestra. This was a small group, and I was the only new freshman that year. I think it was about 14 kids at the most. My director was a very cool guy, and he was very accommodating since I was new to the learn a piece in X amount of weeks, then be ready to perform it here strategy. Again, I was a casual player. I was still on book 4 of the Suzuki collection. This did not sit well with the first chair for violins. Let's call him Guy. Guy was a junior, a top-scoring student, and had a bunch of other accolades to his name. My mom also apparently knew Guy. When she did recess duty at my previous school, Guy was constantly giving her lip and always brushed her off to seem cool. According to her and some gossip, he was one of those instant gratification-only child types. The kids who are spoiled rotten by their parents so they never have to wait. My mom did not like his spoiled baddiness, and when she heard he was the first chair of my orchestra, she was already getting some oh god sort of vibes from him, but said nothing to not make me worry. Guy was a very intense leader. I think his instant gratification attitude spilled over into his musical pursuits. He was highly competitive and took his role as first chair very seriously. From day one, he made it clear that he didn't think I belonged in the orchestra. He would make snide comments about my playing, question my abilities, and generally make me feel unwelcome, especially with my other orchestra members. He always went out of his way to exclude me. I wasn't too bothered by it at first, but it did slowly chip away at me. I continued to practice diligently and work hard to prove myself. Slowly but surely, I started to gain confidence in my playing. My director was supportive and encouraged me to keep pushing forward, and I will always thank him for that. In early fall, we were due to have an open house for incoming freshmen/families, and my orchestra group was supposed to be there and perform for a few hours to get kids to join. Unfortunately, a few days before, my dad had some sudden medical complications, ruptured spleen. Because it was so sudden and out of nowhere, I didn't have time to really tell my director that I wouldn't be able to make it due to the family emergency. The open house was on Sunday, and my director called my house that very Sunday to try and figure out where I was. Admittedly, I panicked when the director called. It totally slipped my mind. I think I said something like, "Sir, I apologize for all this, but my dad's in the hospital, he's having surgery, and it's been serious and complicated, and I just don't know what's going to happen. I apologize for not giving you a proper heads up, but it's just been a haze all weekend." Tried to remain cool and calm, even though I was mentally freaking the hell out. Thankfully, my director was very understanding and even talked to me and my mom to make sure we were doing okay. He said that it was no big deal that I was missing out since this was a smaller event and I should focus more on my own mental health more than anything. It was nice to have such an understanding guy. I don't think he told any of the other members out of respect for my privacy, but Guy was frankly pissed about the whole situation. He was stewing on it for a while. Thankfully, my dad's surgery was a success and he was doing better. Of course, Guy had to spoil my mood. The orchestra room at my school is usually open in the mornings, which lets kids drop off their instruments for the day. The day after the performance, I walked in to put my violin in its usual spot, and Guy angrily confronted me about why I missed out, pitching a whole scene in front of the others who were hanging out in there. I have no idea why he did this, but it was clear he was trying to embarrass me. He accused me of being unreliable and letting the team down, saying that my absence reflected poorly on the orchestra as a whole. He yelled, "What the hell gives you a pass to skip yesterday?" And at this point, I've already been stressed for the better part of a weekend, so I decide to get some petty revenge right now. I'm guessing he wants me to just start crying, so I do. He looks satisfied for a second before I yell out, loud enough for people outside to hear, "My dad was in surgery, you dick," and then run off. Was I acting? Yes. But did it instantly shut him up? Absolutely. I got told this by a buddy in band, but after I ran out, Guy looked like he'd swallowed a damn frog at that moment. Everyone in the room was giving him a look that said, "What the hell, Guy?" and he looked like he wanted to yell at everyone. After that, I guess he tried to pitch another fit in the group chat with all his older buddies. And I think they chewed him out too, because from their perspective, he just yelled at a freshman whose dad was having a damn medical emergency. I got stopped by a few of them in the hall, and they checked in, saw if I was doing better, just extending the basic definition of empathy. It was nice to see, and I think they felt better when I confirmed some stuff. Word got back to the director quick. He must have chewed Guy a new one, because when I got into orchestra that day, Guy looked very defeated. He didn't even look at me until the director took the stand. First off, he said the open house was a moderate success, and congratulated the group who played. However, he shifted gears and said he was very disappointed by some infighting within the group, and immediately turned towards Guy. He cleared his throat, and asked if he had anything to say to me. Guy let out a very weak, "I'm sorry," and began hastily setting up his music stand. It was a very pathetic apology, but I wasn't exactly going to sulk about not getting one. I had a lot more important things to focus on. After class, my director asked how I was doing, if my dad's surgery went okay, etc. Again, cool guy. I hope he's enjoying retirement. The director ended up emailing my mom about what happened, knowing that the little crap that defied her authority back then got some minor comeuppance was a little petty revenge for her, carried out unintentionally by me. And the cherry on top? My dad came home the exact same day, so that was another weight lifted off my shoulders. Guy did revert back to his usual rudeness, but he never blew up on me again to that effect. A bunch of his orchestra buddies did end up befriending me, so I had an enjoyable 2 years with them before they all graduated. After that, I ended up taking Guy's chair, and I promised myself I'd be more laid back and understanding with other members than he was with me. I think it worked out pretty good. We were a smaller group at that point, but still a really great sounding one. The next one is a malicious compliance story. Around 2008, I was a radiology assistant in a mammography unit, meaning I was the person who ushered in patients, showed them where to put their belongings, gives them the gown and instructions. Another part of my job was keeping the radiology station clean and tidy so that work surfaces were clear and sanitary. Around this same time, The Secret was huge and my coworkers were all way into it. For those who don't know, it is a ridiculous pseudoscientific method pushed by Oprah Winfrey that promised you can get whatever you want simply by visualizing and asking the universe for it. The ugly side of this fairy tale thinking is that if bad things happen to you, it's your fault because you invited it by putting bad energy out into the universe. I found it wildly inappropriate that healthcare professionals believed that breast cancer victims had caused their own cancers through negative thinking. I fought with a few of the radiology techs about it, but I was completely outnumbered, so I tried to just keep my head down, focus on patients, and do my job, which included tidying up their O magazines, secret books, and other secret-related materials so that they would leave strewn all over the counters. Since they all hated me for not being in their secret clique, they decided to hang up on me and go to the managers with complaints about my attitude. I was called out of work into a disciplinary ambush meeting where I explained my side of things. One of the higher-up managers totally agreed with me and defended me. But at the conclusion of the meeting, I was told not to touch anyone else's stuff because there were complaints that I was shoving magazines into the corners and threw away someone's copy of The Secret. I really wish I had, but I actually did not do that. It was a complete lie. So, by complaining about me, my idiotic coworkers effectively took away the part of my job which was cleaning up after them. I was no longer allowed to touch their magazines, so they piled up 2 inches deep on every surface, plus empty bottles and yogurt containers, used napkins, cafeteria trays, popcorn detritus, and all sorts of other trash. The workstation looked like a landfill. They would be absolutely seething about it and glaring at me, but I would sit there reading, happily doing absolutely nothing about it since I wasn't allowed to touch their stuff. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already.